Hi everyone, just a quick disclaimer. I want you to know that this is about getting a decent paint job on your Pinewood Derby car using spray cans. It's not a video for getting a automotive quality paint job or a custom quality paint job on your Pinewood Derby car. It's just a good, clean paint job out of spray cans. There is a big difference. All right, on with the show. Hi, I'm George Weber, and this is my YouTube channel, Gwebberarts. We're in my studio today, and we're going to talk about painting a Pinewood Derby car. Some of you guys might know me as Coffin Nail Racing, and that's probably why you're here. You want to learn how I paint my Pinewood Derby cars. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about the basic tools, and then we'll go on from there. Obviously, you'll want a Pinewood Derby car. This one's completely raw. It hasn't been sanded or shaped, so this is just for demo purposes in terms of showing you a couple of things. So we're not going to worry about that, but we are going to talk about tools. Again, you're going to want sandpaper. I strongly suggest 220 to do your finish wood sanding. So this wood is pretty smooth and doesn't have a lot of deep grains or things like that. If you find any real problem areas, put a little wood putty or even gel super glue for really small problems and just sand it out. When you're doing your paint work, you're going to need 320 for your initial sanding and 600 when you start getting into your final colors. I strongly suggest having a tack rag, and it's just what I suggest. It's a rag permeated with a sticky substance that will wipe the dust off of your paint after you've sanded it, and you want to do that between every coat when you sand, whether it's the wood or the paint. Just clean all the dust off. Keep your tack rags in a plastic bag to keep them clean. You're going to want tape, masking tape like this. This is painter's tape as opposed to masking tape. Masking tape is too adhesive, and it also, because of the way the glue and the edges and the paper are put together, it tends to leak more than painter's tape does. And this is a lower tack. It'll come off the body much easier. Have different sizes of this because you want to be able to do different things, and I'll show you in a minute about that. Another thing that you'll want is, if I can get it out, vinyl fine line striping tape, or fine line pro band. You know, it comes under several different names, but it's fine line tape, and this comes in different sizes: 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, and I think even smaller sizes. And it's a vinyl tape that's especially for doing automotive paint work. So this you get at your local automotive paint supply place, or you can get it online. Same with the tack rags. You can get those online or in your local automotive paint supply shop. Obviously, an X-Acto knife is a very handy thing to have when doing paint work. You'll need it. I suggest having a really sharp blade and a dull blade as well, because there's times where you're going to be lifting tape, and a dull blade is less likely to cut your paint in ways that you don't want it to. A few small round-tipped paint brushes. These are handy for doing little touch-ups and whatnot. We'll talk about that. Cutting board. This is what they call a self-healing cutting board. You guys probably have seen them before. You might even already have one. These are great for cutting out a fast pattern on a piece of tape and then pulling it off, lifting your little design and then putting it down on the car. Now obviously I would be putting this on top of primer, or I would be putting it on top of a base color, not the wood. So that's one of the reasons you want to have a cutting pad that's self-healing. It's just really great for doing that kind of work. My first big tip on painting cars is cut strips of tape, about a 1/2 inch wide, give or take. And what I like to do is, now the pros, they're going to have drilled holes, but this body has slots, and in some cases you might have both. I put my tape over my drill holes about 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit more depending on the body, and then fold it under. And my reasoning for this, other than obviously covering the axle hole, because you don't want to get paint in your axle hole or in your axle slot, is that when you want to glue the little washers onto the body, those washers are going to adhere to the wood much better than they do to the paint. And also, if for any reason you need to take a washer off, you're not going to tear your paint off, because you're leaving a blank spot. So every time you paint a few layers of paint, like you do your primer's dry, you pull this off and you put a new one on, you do your color coat, pull this off, put a new one on, do your next color coat. And that way this stays clean and it doesn't get buried under layers and layers of paint if you keep changing it. So that's my first big tip as far as that goes. Next thing, paint, primer. Hear that sound? Again, you might know this. Paints all have agitator balls in them, and you want to shake up your paint and really get that paint agitated. You're mixing all the pigments in with the solvents, and I strongly suggest doing this for a minute, if not 2 minutes, of agitating it in different ways, in different directions, and really getting your paint mixed well. The reason being is when you're spraying, you're less likely to clog up the tip when you do that. So I really strongly suggest agitating your paint really, really, really well. Spray paint also works much better in warm weather than it does in cold weather. So keep that in mind as well. Okay. The last thing I'm going to suggest, and I don't have mine right in front of me, is a respirator. Now, in the video, you're going to see me spray painting without a respirator, and it's because I need to be able to talk to you guys. But when you are painting, I strongly suggest getting a good respirator. They come in different sizes, so make sure you get one that fits you well. And even if you're painting outdoors, use it. Spray paint is nasty stuff, and it's really not good to be breathing it if you can avoid it. All right, so that's it on tools and a couple of quick tips about taping off your axles. Now we're going to go on to the next phase, which is priming the body. All right, so I'll see you in a little bit. My first tip for when painting a car, you're starting out with your primer. Shake your paint cans really well. I mean, seriously. I can't tell you how many times people just go and start spraying and it just doesn't work. It'll clog up the tip, it'll spit garbage. It's shooting more propellant than it is paint. Shake it up for a good 1 to 2 minutes in different ways to really get that paint mixed up and in there. Second tip, your first coat of primer, put it on light. I mean fog it so that you can still see wood through that first coat of primer. Normally I'd be wearing a paint mask, but you wouldn't be able to hear me, so that wouldn't work out too well. So here we go. Okay, hopefully the camera will focus on this. You can still see wood through that first coat of primer. Hopefully you guys can see that. And what I'm doing is I'm letting that flash dry. In other words, I'm letting it dry for about a minute or two before I do the same thing again. Put a nice light coat on. It's better to mist coats on slowly but surely than it is to try to pile it on. It gets into the wood a little better and then seals the surface. Once the surface is sealed, then you can start putting on slightly heavier coats as you go. Okay, so that's been about a minute, maybe less, but here we go, next coat. Be sure to try to get in the nooks and crannies, because that's where you're going to miss it very easily. I'll usually get in there first. That way all those little spaces will have time to dry a little bit before I attack the rest of the body. And I'm following the shape of the car. You don't want to get too close because you could literally blow the body right off your mounting stick. And if you get too close, you're in the middle of the densest part of the spray, which is what you really don't want. Then for the top, one good pass like that, one good pass like that. And we can let that dry for a couple of minutes. Now you should be able to see that that's pretty gray. It's got a few wet spots where the can spit because I had my finger down too low. If you wrap your finger around there too much like that, it'll catch the lip of the spray and it'll pop off the end of your finger and make big spots like that. So watch out for that. Keep your finger well back. That was a little mistake I made. But it'll sand down, no big deal. I can still see the wood grain. That's how thin I've laid this paint on. Now at this point, I'll probably let that dry for a half hour before I put any more coats of primer on. So at this point, I'm gonna put this in its block and let it sit there and let it dry for a while, and we'll be back to go on to the next step. What I'll do is I'll shortcut this. I'll put all the primer on and then we'll go on to the next step so you can see what I'm doing there, okay? All right. Okay, so here's the body that I primed a little while ago. You saw that. And I used a birch plywood on the top of this car, so it shows a little more grain than the basswood does, so it might need a few more layers of primer. I don't know, I'm not too worried about it one way or the other. But in theory, you want to sand, prime, until your body is really smooth. I'm going to start by taking some dry 600 and just going over my axle hole area to knock off the sharp edges just real quickly. That way the sharp edge of where the mask was is gone. We're trying not to build up. I'm using 600 for that because I don't want to take off too much wood. I just want to smooth out that sharp edge of paint. So that gets rid of that. Now I'm using wet or dry sandpaper. I'm starting out with 320 for my primer, and I put it in to soak for a minute or two, and then it's pretty much ready to go. And I'll just start sanding away. Now, when you're sanding, what you're looking for as you sand is it'll start to build up on your paper, of course, and so you want to wash out your paper once in a while. But you're looking for that paint to get smooth. So take a little finger worth of water, rub it on the top of that paper towel real quickly, because if you start showing wood, you don't want the water to soak into the wood. And when you look at it, low spots will show up as being very shiny, and high spots will show up as being cut through. You can see there's little lines of what look like wood there. So if that was probably a raised piece of grain, and now when I've sanded it, it's starting to cut it down. And I'll keep sanding here until that's almost all the primer is off. That way I know that it's nice and smooth. A little more like that. Wipe it down again. Now you can see even more of the wood. But you know that that's pretty smooth now. You can run your finger over it. The area between this rise and that rise is a low point. So we're still on the high side, so you want to keep feathering that a little more. Wet your paper again to flush out the primer, because it'll load up on you, so you want to flush it out. And we're just sanding away on that spot, working it in slightly different directions. Don't always go in the same direction. A little circular motion if need be. Wipe it off. Now it's looking pretty good. I've cut through most of the primer, and I want to avoid it now because I can feel the wood is starting to get moist, and I don't want that to happen. But I know that that's going to be a lot smoother for my second coat of paint. And we just continue that way throughout the entire body, the sides of the fenders, the body. We're looking for high points and low points. Looking for pinholes. If you find pinholes, you can use a little super glue to fill them in. I usually use a gel super glue. This one in particular I like a lot. It's got the little squeeze gizmos on the side, so you can really get like a single drop of gel super glue on a pinhole really easily, and then just wipe over it with a piece of post-it note, and it'll fill that pinhole. On this body, because I'm just doing a demo, I'm probably not going to get too crazy with going into great detail on the paint job, but it should come out more than well enough to give you the general understanding of how to get a good paint job out of spray cans, because it is possible. It's all about technique. And the first and biggest technique is not to just sit there and bomb a gallon of paint on top of it. The more paint you put down quickly, the more orange peel, that weird textury look you get. So it's much better to put down thinner layers and sand them and get them smoothed out. And then put on another layer and do the same thing again. So yeah, it's a little on the tedious side, especially when you have to get into corners and things like that. It can be a real pain in the butt. And you have to let paint dry. You can't just go at it, go at it, go at it. You have to let it dry for a while between coats. See, now here you can see I have a big gap in that seam where this piece of wood and that piece of wood meets. There's a great big gap. When it was raw wood, I couldn't see that. But now that it has primer on it, I can see it. Same with this back fender. You see that big gap where the two pieces of wood were glued together. Now, what I'll do is I'll sand this primer, and once it's sanded, I'll put my super glue on there and just wipe it, and that'll fill those gaps pretty well. And my next coat of primer should cover it. And wind up looking pretty good. So let's do that now on this fender, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Get a post-it note here. And I'll fold my post-it note in half. Get a nice sharp edge on it. Take my super glue. Now this is gel super glue. You don't want the liquidy kind. It won't fill. It'll run everywhere. And I can just ease on a little tiny bead like so. Just a little tiny bead like that. And then I just take that piece of paper and just wipe it. And that'll fill in most of the gap. Usually you can pretty well see it when it's gone, you know. Now, when that dries, I'll sand that real quickly, and when I put another coat of primer on it, I'll know almost immediately whether or not the gap is closed or not. I might have to do that a couple of times, you never know. So that's it for this particular portion. I'm just going to keep sanding away at this until I get it good and smooth, and then I'm going to put on a second coat of primer and we'll take a look at it. Alright, so we'll be back later. Okay, so just a couple more quick tips. I've got this all sanded. My first coat of primer, you saw I was getting ready to did some sanding on it. Now it's all sanded down. Everything is nice and smooth. I did a few fill-ins and whatnot. When you're sanding on a body, when you sand it, you don't have to press down real hard, but just kind of go along. And again, be aware that your paper is going to load up, so wet it once in a while. Wipe the body once in a while, because the primer will start to build up a mud. and you want to keep that mud off the car. But as you're sanding, you'll start to notice that at first the sandpaper kind of, it's cutting. And then after a minute or so, as the paint gets smoother, the sandpaper is just going to glide right over the surface. And it'll literally feel like you're skating on ice instead of having all this roughness going on. Like this little spot I've got right here that I just noticed. There we go. Now, once everything's sanded to your liking, before you run out and put another coat of primer on, use your tack rag and tack it off, because I promise you there's going to be primer dust. Guaranteed, there always is. And when it comes to paint is this funny thing. You think, oh, I'll just put a heavier coat of paint on that and it'll fill that in. No, it doesn't. It doesn't fill in. What it does is it makes the high points higher as it's filling in the low points, but it's also making the high points higher. So you wind up with the same crappy look and feel as you had before. Or in some areas, like in the back of fenders and things like that, tight areas, the paint will be like granules almost. And if you don't sand that down, it'll get grainier and grainier and grainier, and it'll get pretty ugly pretty fast. If you're painting in very cold weather, you'll get what's known as orange peel. The surface of the paint will look really bumpy, liney, kind of strange, like an orange peel almost. And that's usually an indication that the paint is too cold. So you want to paint in warm weather if you can. Now, if you do get orange peel, and I'm likely to get orange peel because down here in the garage it's always cold. Once you have gotten to that point, you can make sure your paint dries really well, and you can sand your color or your clear, depending on what it is, and smooth that out. And then put a real light coating of your color or your clear or whatever it happens to be on top, preferably when it's warmer, and you should wind up with a pretty smooth surface. Alright, so this is pretty clean. So I'm going to put my next coat of primer on now, and I'll set up the camera and we'll do a quick shot of that. Alright, be back in a little bit. Okay, so here we go. I've got my body, it's on a stick. Got my white semi-gloss primer paint. It's a paint and primer kind of job. I've already tested this with the color coat that I plan on using, and it seems to be okay. If I'm wrong, I'm screwed, but it seems to be okay. Again, don't get up close. Start out with a mist coat. I'm putting just little short bursts, getting mostly in the nooks and crannies, getting in underneath, and just putting my first layer just like that. You can probably still see the gray and the wood in certain areas coming through that white. Again, I'm going to let this flash dry for probably a minute or so. and then I'll put on some more coats. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off camera for now, put on my other coats because you already know what I'm doing, and then we'll see how that goes. All right, so we'll be back later on. Okay, so we're back again. I've got my white paint primer laid down. I'm using white paint primer on this at this point because the particular color I'm going to be using is a pretty light color, and it's also got some slight translucence to it. Plus, I want to use the white as part of the design. So, again, last night I painted the fog coat, as you saw, a couple more fog coats, and then after that dried for a while, I started putting on slightly heavier coats. About every 30 minutes I would put on, I'd put on a pretty good heavy coat, and then wait 30 minutes and then put another heavy coat on. So about 2 more good coats, and that usually will do the job. You'll be able to tell. You don't want to get them so heavy that you get runs. You have to watch out for that, of course, but you want them heavy enough that you can really tell that the paint is a liquid on the surface. Then I let it dry overnight, so roughly 12 hours. The longer you let it dry, the better, especially in warm weather. It's going to dry and cure a lot quicker than it is in cold weather, obviously. So once I got my white primer done, I sanded it with 320. I've already done that, using a little water to keep the sandpaper wet. One tip that in this particular instance doesn't matter: when you're sanding along edges, you need to be really careful because an edge will cut through. You can see where I've cut through a lot easier than a flat surface. A flat surface will sand pretty well, but an edge, if you hit it with too much pressure, you'll cut right through. And you're really not trying to sand deep on your base color. Let's say you were painting you've already done your primer coats and whatnot, and you're painting the car black, and this was black. You only need to sand it, enough to get most of the shine off of it. That's what you're looking to do, is to get it smooth enough that most of the shine is gone, and give the paint job some tooth for the next coat to adhere to. So you're just trying to knock off any small imperfections and get the shine off of it so that your next coat of paint will adhere to it well. Now, in this particular paint job, again, I'm using the white as part of the color scheme. So this white primer paint, because it's a primer paint combination, is again is my base color. It's part of my paint scheme. So I'm just cleaning it off with the tack rag. Always clean it off with a tack rag. And then once I get this done, we're going to lay down some tape, and we'll show you that. All right, so this is my self-healing cutting board. I really suggest having one of these if you're going to be cutting mask designs, and they're just great in general for all sorts of uses. So I'm going to take my tape, get a good measurement of what I need, because that's going to go underneath the nose of the car. And then I'm just going to cut that off my roll like that. And I'm going to lay this just like that. And I'm pulling that a little bit taut, not super tight. And I'm just gently tacking it down for the moment. I'm not pressing it down hard because I might need to make adjustments. I don't know. And I'm going to lay that. Try to get it to look as much like the other side as I can. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And just now, I've taken blue tape, my painter's tape, and did this last night, and I cut out a design, and I'm gonna see if this is gonna work for me. It may not, you know, I don't know. It's gonna give me trouble. I've opted to go with flames, and I can tell you from personal experience, flames are the biggest pain in the butt there is to paint on a car, whether it's a real car, a model car, makes no difference. So here we go. Again, flames are always problematic at the very best, so I can't even guarantee I'm going to manage this, but I'm going to try it because I figure you guys deserve to see something really pretty cool looking. I'm going to do like that. All right. Then I'm going to tack it down. Easy. One of the big problem areas that you run into with flames is the points. They can very easily wind up not doing what you want them to do at all. All right, guys, just to review quickly. As you may recall, I used my white paint primer, sanded that with the 320 to get a good tooth on there. I've laid out my paint job using tape and cutting tape. Again, flames are very difficult to do on even a real car. They're a pain in the butt. One of the big tricks is to make sure your tape is well adhered. Anytime the tape crosses over itself, use your fingernail right along the edge to make sure it's pressed in so you get a good seal. Then one of the other big tricks is your first coat of paint, fog it, just like you did with the primer. Just fog it. And the reason for that is that light coat of paint will seal your edges of your tape. Your first couple of coats should be really nice and light for that reason, is to get the paint to just kiss the edges of the tape and dry there and seal it instead of creeping under it. If you paint really heavily, it's going to creep under it. To some degree, it can creep under it anyways, but this reduces that problem greatly. All right, now that's really light. I mean, I can see the white through a lot of areas here. It's a little heavy in a couple of places, but not too much. It should seal that tape down pretty good. Now I'm gonna wait about 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'm gonna fog it again. So I'm gonna go off camera, I'm gonna wait that time, and then we'll fog it again, and then we'll really lay it on, all right? We'll be back. Okay, so now we're going to do our second fog coat. This time I'm going to make sure to get in the edges by the fenders, the backs of the fenders, and so on. Again, I'm going to keep it light. The whole time I was off camera, I was shaking my paint, making sure that it's well agitated. I'm paying special attention to the little corner areas before I do the main body, because that's where your paint is going to want to build up or not get into when you need it to. I've got pretty much all the corners on the top side. Let's get on the underside here. All right, that looks pretty good. I can still see white in some areas, and I'm going to let that flash for just a minute. And then we'll coat the entire body. I'm looking for spots that need special attention. Tops of the fenders, sides of the fenders, still along the inside edge there, a little bit here, and of course the top of the body. All right, so here we go. I'm going to spray the sides first. Get in those corners again. Get underneath the body first as I work my way around it. Making sure I got a pretty good coat everywhere, and then we're going to do the top. And we're going to get it with a couple good coats. That looks pretty good. I think it's going to be best to let it dry overnight. Then I'll peel back the tape and see what we've got. All right. When you pull tape, this is a little trick that, it's no big deal, and you may already know it, is you want to pull your tape more than 90 degrees bent back over itself. So, as you can see, I've got it really bent way back over like that. I'm not pulling up, I'm pulling back. So as I pull it this way, just take my time, don't rush. And most of the time you'll get a nice clean pull. One thing that's nice about the vinyl tape is it'll stick to the body quite well, but at the same time it'll come off very easily. Then as I come down the flames, as I get to the curves, I tend to walk it back and forth like this, so that I'm pulling up the curves gently and slowly. I've got a few little leaks there, nothing too dramatic yet. And then it just comes right along. And there we go. Like this is kind of buried and there's no end to grab up. That's where things can get really tricky. You want to get in there very carefully. You can see that there's nothing to grab onto. On a real car or on something that's big enough, you can make a little tape tab before you paint it, and that tape tab will help you pull it up. But on something this small, you really can't do that. So you need to get an X-Acto knife, preferably actually a dull one, and get right at the edge and just gently catch that tape because you don't want to damage the paint underneath, and you don't want to damage the paint on top. And as the tape starts to lift, you'll be able to finally get at an end, grab it, and just pull it right off like that. Voila. So far, so good. All right, I'm going to go off camera for a minute, and I'm going to do the rest of this tape now that you've got the general idea, and we'll go on to the next step. All right? Okay, so we've pulled all the tape off, and now we have the white and the purple. And the first thing you'll notice is there's little sharp edges along the tape lines. So what you want to do is you want to take 600 wet or dry paper, get it wet, let it soak for a while, and very gently, I mean very gently, just go over the edges. Go across to the edges, don't follow the edges, go across them. And that's going to knock down that sharp edge a tiny bit. You don't need to get crazy with it. It doesn't need to be absolutely smooth. It just needs to be knocked down a little bit so it's not horrendous. And what you're going to do once you get it all sanded down like that, very gently and lightly, is you're going to start putting clear on it. And as you put successive coats of clear on it, it's going to bury that edge, because you're going to put clear, and then you're going to sand the clear, and then you're going to put some more clear, and you're going to sand the clear again, and then you're going to put a final coat of clear on, and that's going to bury those edges, and it'll be really pretty smooth. And that's the way you do it on real cars as well. So you can just sand it a little more on real cars because the paint's thicker. All right, so I'm going to do that all off camera and get that ready. But before I go off camera, I'm going to give you a little tip. And I'll probably not do it on this body because I just don't care enough. But you'll see I've got a little paint divot there, just a little bad spot. Normally what I would do is I would take a paint cap and I would spray paint into my cap until I had a little puddle, and I'd pick up a little bit and I would very carefully fill that divot, and I might fill that divot a couple of times as it dries until I get a slightly higher level of white than what's sprayed down. Once it's really well dried, I would take my 600 and just sand it gently until it looked reasonably smooth. This is underneath, so I really don't care. If it was on top, I would care a little bit more, obviously. So that's something you can do if you have little paint leaks along your edges and things like that. You can usually take a little bit of your white or you know, whatever your color is, and you can usually just lightly touch the color on there and cover up your paint leaks, and then gently sand them so that they're smooth enough that when the clear coat starts going on, it will hide them pretty well. All right, so I'm going to finish this up and then we'll go on to our next steps. Okay guys, we're going to start doing some special effects, and this is always a gamble because you never know what you're going to get for sure. Now what I've got here is my original purple color, the purple flake, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray it in such a way that it's going to create little specks, little dots of paint on my white in order to give it a little more texture and interest. And the way you do that is, instead of spraying at the car, you spray pointing up and gently press the button until it starts to sputter. You don't want to get a full-on, you want to sputter. And it'll literally start spitting paint. So here we go. It's hard to get it just right. I've had to do it a few times over here. This is not one of the more cooperative paint cans. There we go. It's good. And the heavier droplets of paint will fall. Sometimes you can wrap your finger around a little bit and get in the way of the paint, and it'll blow it off the end of your finger, which is what I might have to do with this, because this paint can is very unforgiving in terms of control. There we go. Now I've got a big old mess of paint there. I can kind of get it to spit and sputter in different ways. That's the one. There we go. So that's basically created some strange textures there. Now, before that even dries, I have another paint here. This is translucent, and it's a very similar color to my purple flake, but it's very translucent. Now, I shook this up earlier, and I'm just going to haze that over it. And that's starting to turn my white very pinkish purple. Trying to get it even as I can. It's one of the problems with translucent colors, is trying to get them even. Okay, and now I have a stripe job, and it's ghosted on. I'm going to do a little fade on the back end of the car to hide the stripes back here, so that as they come over the top of the body, they vanish to a certain degree. There we go. That's not bad. I kind of like that. I'm going to do the same to the nose of the flame, right in the middle. Just really kind of ghost it. Try to catch the corners of those fenders a little bit. Yeah, Daddy likes that. All right, a little more of the translucent on top of all that. There we go. One more little touch right there. All right, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera very well, because the lighting is terrible. but I've literally coated the flames so now they're a very similar color to the rest of the body, but you can still see them. They're ghosted in. I'm going to take this into the studio and see if I can show you under better lighting. Hold on one second. Now you can see it. What do you think of that, huh? Now, my next step, when this dries overnight, is I will go over it again with 600 very, very lightly, because that paint is super thin. And then I'll clear coat it. The only reason I'm going over it with 600 is just to knock down a couple of little high spots in the paint. So it's going to be super gentle. And then we're going to just bury that whole thing in clear. Okay, so we're starting to get into and finish up the clear coat section. And what I've done is the other night, as the way I normally do it with any other coat of paint, I fog on the first layer and let that tack up for a minute, you know, flash dry for a minute or so. Then after the first fog coat goes down, I'll put on another coat and let that flash dry for a minute. And each coat is slightly heavier than the last. I don't get crazy with it, but I build up. So after about the first 3 good fog coats, I should have at least a reasonable coat of clear on there, and I'll let that dry for about 10 minutes or so. Then I'll put on a heavier coat, and that will dry overnight. Once that's dried overnight, at least, I'll do my 600 wet or dry sanding. And what I'm doing is, when I sand, I'm again chasing the edges of the paint by cutting across them. And as I do, and I wipe the body dry every time, you'll notice, like in this, you'll be able to see it, I think. You'll notice how along the edges of the design where the tape is, there's parts where it's still shiny and parts where it looks dull. It's like little dots at this point, little shiny dots. And what that is the shiny spots are the low points and the dull spots are the high points of where I've sanded. Now, you don't want to get too crazy, but you want to sand down your clear just enough that you start to get an effect something like this. Now, if you've really laid on the paint heavy, you can go and sand further, but I always go on the side of caution and not get too crazy with it, because once it gets to this point, your next couple of coats of clear should bury it pretty well and come out pretty smooth. Alright, so we're shooting outside now, and it's a sunny day. I'm under some trees, which I probably shouldn't be, but it's the only good spot available. Also, it's kind of breezy out, which is also not really perfect, but it's what we got, so that's what we're going to do. I hope I'm reasonably in frame so you can see what I'm doing. I hope you can hear me. As always, I'm going to start by fogging on a coat, let that dry for a minute, then fog on a couple more light coats, and then we're going to drown it. Alright, so as I mentioned before, I was going to tape up the axle holes. That one light coat of paint doesn't matter, because I'm going to rough sand these a little bit before I glue on the Durolin washers anyways, so that really doesn't matter. So the last coat of clear is probably dried 5, maybe 10 minutes. Because of the warm weather, it's already dry to the touch, but the solvents in the paint will definitely cut into it. And now that I've got a pretty decent layer on there, as a starting coat, I'm going to finish it off with a fairly heavy coat. I wished it wasn't so windy so that I could really focus my paint better, but it is what it is, so we have to hope for the best. Again, I'm going to start underneath, then the sides, and then I'm going to come down the inside of the fenders and then come down the middle of it, making a few passes. I'm going to get progressively heavier as I go. I'm going to get to the point where it looks wet. So you'll see, when you're painting, you'll see it. It'll look wet to you. And you don't want to get to the point where it runs, but you want it to look wet. You can see the breeze is just pushing my paint away from the car. It's a real pain. It means I have to get in much closer and spray much faster in order to avoid getting wet runs. Alright, so that's the underside. Now I'll do the top side of the fenders. I'm laying it on pretty heavy at this point. And we'll do the inside of the fenders. And I'm going to give that just a second. Hopefully the breeze will die down just a little bit so I can do the top of the car and get a real good solid coat on there. Oh yeah, that looks good. I hope you can see that. That looks really nice and wet without looking runny anywhere. I'm going to let that tack up for a minute. Not quite as heavy. All right, let me get behind the camera and see if I can get a clear shot of this for you. And up into the sun. Let's try this. Ah, you can see it. See, that's pretty wet. And it looks like I may have a dust flake in the very nose of the car from something blowing in the wind, but that's all right. All right, so we're going to take this back inside. I think it looks pretty good. We'll let that dry overnight. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed the video on painting a Pinewood Derby car. I also hope that you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel here. If you're really liking the video and really feel like you got something out of it, I hope you'll make a little donation through PayPal to our video creating attempts at gwebberarts@gmail.com. I'll put that down in the comments below so you can get an idea of where you can send in a donation or send in questions about the paint job. If you don't want to put comments in the YouTube channel, you can always email me and ask me little questions about that kind of stuff. So again, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned a lot. It was a lot of fun to do. So I'll hopefully see you guys at the Pinewood Derby tracks, and we'll be racing. All right, see you then.